few other units did see a decent amount of combat. Most of these guys are actually just pressed in for labor. They're going to be hauling ammunition, digging latrines, doing extra fatigue detail because a lot of these guys they didn't trust them in combat. And in some cases they were worried too that if you send the black guys out to get killed, that there's political ramifications. And we'll see when we talk about the Battle of the Crater a little bit later in Petersburg what happens with this one. Now, to be fair, the South actually did have a sizable number of African Americans in their army as well. Some as soldiers, some as non-combatant soldiers. The problem with, of course, tracking this down is the fact that the Union Army kept track of who was what color. The Confederate Army didn't, and of course the Confederate Army overall record keeping is pretty low. But it shouldn't surprise us that not nearly as many are going to serve in the Confederate Army. Mostly they're reserved for labor and the support services of the Army as well. There was, for those of you interested, there was also an African American Confederate soldier from Madison. We got his letters from after the war. He talks about going to veterans reunions and things like that. So it did happen, but it was obviously going to be a lot more rare. This is the assault on Battery Wagner. This is Shaw. He's getting killed as he's leading his men up and over the top, trying to drive these Confederates out of this fort in South Carolina. This is a little bit better reproduction of the scene as the fighting is taking place, as they're trying to get up and over this kind of earthen berm to attack it. They would fail to capture the fort. They would do as well as any other unit, and it really kind of proves the point. For those of you who've ever seen the film from the 1980s, it's a film called Glory. It's got Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman in it. Matthew Broderick plays Shaw. It's actually a pretty good war film, and basically most of the guys that you'll see in here, see in that movie, they're all the Civil War soldiers are reenactors. This is a regiment of African American troops, United States colored troops, as they were often referred to. On there, they got their dress uniforms on. They're looking good for their dress inspection, and you'll notice that their commanding officer is in fact not an officer, at least not a commissioned officer. He's a non-commissioned officer. He is a sergeant. He's got his non-commissioned officer's sword out because you couldn't be a commissioned officer and be black. It just is not going to happen, at least not yet in American history. Relatively rare photograph of an African American Confederate soldier, but it did happen from time to time, right? So let's look at this then from sort of general point of view of what soldiers' life was like. So when you understand a little bit of why do these guys go on, those that survive the war, what do they bring back, kind of to the homeland, and how does this then color and influence post-war history? Well, you've got to understand what these guys go through, North or South. Life for both sides in the Army was extremely difficult, okay? You had to march long distances, you had to endure harsh weather, you're outside in the rain, in the cold, in the heat, bugs, everything. A lot of the food that they had to eat was nasty. A lot of these guys are going to get pretty horrendous intestinal troubles. It's going to kill a lot of these people. And so you've got these huge, long periods of kind of boredom and privation that are then punctuated with these bloody, terrifying battles where you're seeing people that you may have known since childhood literally blown to pieces. And you're seeing these huge numbers of men gunned down, mutilated. It is not a pleasant kind of thing. When we think about the Civil War, when we think about the horrible things, we for the most part think about the battles, especially when we think about death. But in fact, the worst killer of the war was not being blown away, being hit by an artillery shell. It was disease. Okay, this is for the most part prior to a good advent of a medical response to germ theory. These little microbes that get in you and they make you sick. They give you these infections from the food you eat. All this kind of stuff. And we're going to see that for every soldier that died in battle, 2 soldiers are going to die of disease. And in some cases, it was as simple as, you get these guys from various, districts of a state that haven't spent a lot of time together, and so they got different immune systems, and then a yellow fever outbreak just comes in and kills a huge number of these guys. So, you get these, these sort of big problems, these outbreaks of pox, in the camps. And these guys, they haven't fought in a battle yet at all, and they're dropping dead like flies. So, major problem. As I said, they get the nasty food that they've got to eat. One of the major problems they get is what's called dysentery. You eat bad food. Basically, you get so sick to your stomach that you die. Okay, this is really, really bad. All right. Now, if you're wounded in battle, a lot of these guys are going to face amputation, as the bullets of the time are a little different than what you'll see bullets used in battle. Bullets used in battle today are, for the most part, steel-jacketed bullets, really, really hard metal. They're relatively small in diameter, some of them 7-8 millimeters in diameter. Sometimes, NATO rounds are a little smaller. And so they're also moving faster than the speed of sound. So they're moving very, very quickly. And if they hit you in the arm or something like that, hard metal goes through, it's got a nice point. It goes through very quickly. Bone breaks. You get a doctor, resets the bone, you get a cast. Probably, 6-8 weeks later, you're going to be okay. All right. These guys are going to be hit by, for the most part, a 58 caliber lead bullet. Lead is a lot softer metal. It's also going to be moving a lot slower. It's going to be moving slower than the speed of sound. Not so slow that you can kind of see, oh, here it comes, and then try to catch it or anything like that. But it's going to be moving a lot slower. So when it hits a bone, it tends to shatter the bone into a lot of little pieces. And the only way to really put that back together is to put all the pieces, like a jigsaw puzzle back in there, and that's not going to happen. And if you don't put all those pieces back together the right way, it's going to get an infection, and it's going to kill all of you. So the only way in many cases is to cut an arm, to cut a leg, wherever it's hit, you got to cut it off, okay? And of course, you get hit in the abdomen. A lot of these guys don't have a really good firm command of internal medicine. And so in many cases, oh man, you got shot in here. Well, I'm going to sew you up, try to dig the bullet out if I can. But this is a major, major problem. And so you see these guys, in the 1880s, 1890s, these guys are like 40s, 50s, 60s. And you see some guy with one arm, one leg, a Civil War veteran. How'd you know? That's how, okay? So this is the world that they've got to deal with, the world of medicine, or maybe the world of lack of medicine by our standards. But the camaraderie that they form these tight bonds with their groups. The term they had was for their pards, partner, that kind of thing. And they even developed pretty strong relationships with their enemies during times they weren't actively campaigning with each other. What they would do is their pickets as their outlying sort of little listening posts are kind of near each other at night. It's like, hey, Billy Yank, hey, Johnny Reb, I'm coming over. And they would trade coffee for tobacco, and they would trade newspapers. They would occasionally gamble. They would gossip. And they would do this at night. Of course, the next day they go back to killing each other. And they really, in a lot of ways, what's interesting enough about the Civil War is they're different enough to fight each other, but they're similar enough to realize that, we're not that different. We speak the same language. We have the same religions. That kind of thing. So this is a soldier's life. This would actually, if you'd see these guys with camp furniture, it would mean that they've been kind of in one place for a while. The number one food is hardtack. It's made of flour, salt, and water. No yeast, because yeast will go bad. This will get bugs in it, but it'll never go bad. You just sort of tap it on the table and knock the bugs out of it. Or you could just eat it with the bugs in there if you like bugs. But the reason it's called hardtack is because it doesn't have any leavening agent at all. It is ridiculously hard. And not like, I've had crackers. It looks like a big cracker. It's kind of hard. But no, this is like pull your teeth out kind of hard. You have to break it up with the butt of your rifle, or sometimes they would put them in a cup and they'd sort of smash it with the socket of their bayonet. A lot of times what they do is they would also cook it in the bacon grease. So that would kind of soften it up a little bit more. But this is what these guys would eat a lot of, especially when they're on the campaign, because what they spend a lot of time doing is marching. They're walking. Typical sort of on heavy campaign, when you're trying to get somewhere, get an army sort of formed so that you can fight a battle, 20 miles a day. In leather shoes with no sort of cushion. You've got maybe 60 pounds of gear on your back. Everything that you're going to need to sleep and eat while you're campaigning, while you're away from your bases, while you're away from the supply wagons, you're going to have to carry it. And a lot of these guys, are going to determine, what do I really absolutely have to have that I don't want to carry? Maybe just a blanket, maybe just an extra pair of socks, and then a little bit extra food. And I don't really need all this kind of stuff. And so that's going to be what's going to take place here. Here you can see a little bit of the medical world of the Civil War. All these guys have been amputated, missing arms, missing legs, shredded skin. So it's pretty bad stuff for all of these guys. When we get back to the series of military events, all right, after McClellan fails to go after Lee, McClellan in his victory sort of communication to Lincoln, we've defended our soil, meaning that the North is safe from Lee's advance. We've defended our soil. And of course Lincoln's response to that was, it's all our soil. You have to go and you have to conquer the South. And McClellan, again, sort of took his time. He kind of took his time chasing after Lee really slowly. And so Lincoln had really had enough. Okay, fine. Whatever. Right? That's it. McClellan, you're fired. And he's going to be out of military command now for the rest of the war. And he's going to replace him with Ambrose Burnside. And a lot of Burnside, wasn't he the idiot that couldn't get his men across a bridge for like all day because he didn't know that the creek was, like only calf deep? Yeah, that's him. Burnside also had not wanted to be put in charge. He had, said, I don't think I'm ready. Burnside was a political appointee. He's from Rhode Island. He doesn't have, he's not a great sort of military thinker. He wasn't quite as bad, as his reputation from the Battle of Sharpsburg might lead you to believe. He was pretty popular with his men. He was one of the senior corps commanders. So, Lincoln keeps hammering, you need to take charge, you need to take charge. You're a pretty level-headed guy, I like you. Here's a leadership thing. If people keep telling you, I don't think I'm ready to take over, it may be because they're not ready to take over. As we're going to see here, this is going to be another mistake Lincoln is going to make. Burnside, though, okay, all right. So let's see if we understand this straight. Lee has a smaller army. I have a bigger army. We go right at it, right? Lincoln, does that sound good to you? Yeah, it makes logical sense to me, I guess, right? But Lee, again, has this sense that, okay, Burnside is going to be kind of a one-directional kind of thinker, okay? He's going to try to overwhelm us. So let's pick a position where he can't do that. So what Lee's going to do, he's going to move his army opposite the Army of the Potomac near a place called Fredericksburg in northern Virginia, across the Rappahannock River. And so what he's going to do is he's going to find a series of series of springy hills, Maurice Heights, and then a few other sort of elevated positions that give him a great field of fire and a sort of concentric bowl in which to try to cover the approaches leading out of Fredericksburg. So if Burnside wants to move on Richmond, Virginia, he's going to have to come right up to Lee's position where he is. Now, as Burnside's generals, they begin looking across the river, they're like, this is not a very good idea. A lot of these guys, like Hancock and some of these other, generals that have a pretty good level head, they come to Burnside and they're like, dude, we got to not do this. This is not a good idea. We need to go someplace else because Lee's forces are all on these hills. There's a low stone wall protecting a big chunk of it. There's no way we're going to be able to get through this. And he says, nope, I've talked to the president. Strategy is to go forward. We've got the bigger numbers. We're going to crush Lee's army. And so they don't have anything to do but to go and do it. And so they fight their way into the town. The town is being held by a few hundred members of Mississippi rifle regiments. And they kind of fight from house to house and sort of hold these guys off long enough. Eventually the Mississippians kind of pull back. And then as the town begins to fill up with Union troops, that begin forming up on the edge, on the southern side, to begin to try to assault this position. But Lee has had enough time to get a whole system of defenses. He's got a strategic central reserve. He's got these guys in great positions. He's got Longstreet to his left. He's got Jackson to his right. He's got everything basically where he more or less wants it. When he talks to his artillery chief and he says, okay, you got all the big guns kind of placed, how well situated for the fighting are we? And the guy tells Lee, he says, General, when my guns open fire on that field, a chicken couldn't live on it. Meaning that he's got every square inch of that thing covered with cannon fire. And so, Burnside orders his soldiers to go forward, and Lee's forces, partly shielded by that stone wall, and on these high hills, they absolutely slaughter the Army of the Potomac. Thousands of these guys are going to go down in front of Lee's positions at Fredericksburg. So this map gives you a good idea of kind of how Lee's got his forces arrayed. This is Maurice Heights. These are the heights here. It gets a little lower down here on Jackson's right, but he's got some woods that are sheltering his positions. And of course, the U.S. forces are forced to build little bridges to go across the river, and they're going to come right at Lee, and Lee is going to hammer them right back. This is Burnside's. No more questions really need to be asked about sideburns. Yeah, so it went down and up over his upper lip, and then way out to here. So anyway, that's Ambrose Burnside. This is a replica of what the stone wall kind of would have looked like if you go there today. I've been there, or at least it was there, back in the 1990s. And it's a housing subdivision, so the wall's still there in parts, but you don't really get a good feel for what the battle would look like. So, did they fight their way through the Kentucky Fried Chicken parking lot or what? And so this is a contemporary photograph of what it looked like kind of after the battle. You have a few Confederate casualties on the top of this thing, but for the most part, they're just firing down this hill and they're just slaughtering these guys directly in front of them. So this is, if you look at it from the U.S. Army's point of view, you can see this ring of hills as these guys with cannon and rifle fire just pouring shot down onto these guys. Are getting ripped to pieces as they're trying to work their way forward. And the poor Irish Brigade, these guys are sent into fighting again at Fredericksburg, and they're going to get ripped up again pretty badly at the Battle of Fredericksburg. This is from one of those artillery positions I told you about, that they could kill a chicken on the field with all their artillery fire. Gives you a good idea of kind of how nice and wide open a lot of the fields of fire were for the Confederate gunners, as they're able to just blow these guys apart before they, in many cases, before they even really have a chance to kind of return a lot of fire against the Confederate forces here. This is a brigade of North Carolinians who are behind the stone wall, and this is one of the few instances where the Confederates, when they bring up reinforcements, they brought it up not to make their line longer to try to deal with a big enemy, but actually make their line thicker, as they're trying to pour more and more fire in a concentrated space down on these guys. And actually at one point section of the stone wall, what they do is they would line up like 4 deep, and you'd have the man in the front, he would do the actual aiming and firing, and they would pass back the empty musket, and the people behind him would be reloading, and they would just pass him a loaded musket. And so they're down there firing. And it would basically be what to our ears today, because you've got so many people firing so rapidly, in such a short space, it would sound like machine gun firing. And so it's just constantly going off as more and more bullets are being sent down towards the advancing Federal ranks. Well, it turns out that Burnside didn't know what he was doing. Of course, Burnside probably would have been the first one to tell him that. And so Lincoln now is forced to fire another Army of the Potomac commander, Burnside, and he's going to replace him with a guy named Joe Hooker. His nickname, of course, was Fighting Joe, which is a great nickname if you're going to be a general. Fighting Joe, I guess better than, wussing out and running away Joe. So now Hooker comes to the conclusion that attacking Lee on top of these great big string of hills is not right. So he inherits, though, Burnside's position, which is, sort of, they got Fredericksburg there, and they're kind of staring at Lee's army. They're up there. What do we do with them? So he says, all right, what we're going to try to do is we'll feint towards, Lee's lines here, but then we're going to move most of the army upriver. We're going to move them upriver, and we're going to move around Lee's flank, all right, to the west, and then we're going to go through this dense area of growth called the Wilderness area around a city called Chancellorsville. And Lee gets knowledge of this. Okay, he figures out where Hooker's army is going. They're moving to the west. They're moving through this area, and Lee understands that Hooker is a guy that can be rattled. Okay, and Lee breaks all the conventions of military thinking. Okay, which is you've got a superior enemy next to you. One of the things you don't do is divide your army. So what does he do? He divides his army. He leaves a small guarding force on Maurice Heights, and then he marches westward with most of his army, and then he figures out, okay, Hooker's guys are coming here, all right. So what we're going to do is we're going to hold him in the woods a little bit, and then I'm going to divide my army again and send almost all of it with Jackson through the forest to attack Hooker's open southern flank. So we'll come out beside and then behind these guys. Jackson marches his men all day, and then in the afternoon he comes out here on the flank of Hooker's 5th Corps, mostly these German immigrants, and these guys they're just kind of sitting around there waiting for orders to advance. They got their weapons stacked up. They're probably playing cards and cooking, making some coffee over the fire, and just kind of hanging out, waiting for the order to fall in again and go forward. And all of a sudden, off to their right, they see coming out of the woods. They see like deer and then birds and rabbits. This is funny. What is going on here? And then they see why all these things are coming out of the forest is because hordes of screaming gray-clad Confederates are coming out to attack them. In many cases, especially the early units, they're completely swept away in the assault. They're blown to pieces. And what happens is the right flank of Hooker's army begins to fall apart. And since the Confederate forces, even though they're outnumbered by the overall Union forces, they're only hitting one small part of the Union army at a time as they're going through this dense, heavy woods around Chancellorsville. Hooker, for his part, his army is now kind of thrown into confusion. Lee, for his part, has moved a lot of his artillery closer and closer so he can put some key locations under artillery fire. Hooker's trying to get things kind of reorganized when as he's on the porch of the house that he's using as headquarters, Lee is giving orders, and then all of a sudden a Confederate artillery shell comes and shatters the beam that he was leaning on, and part of it smacks him in the head. And we think that probably he would have had what you and I would maybe refer to as a concussion, because when he gets up, he's just not himself. He's just, what's going on? We need to get out of here. And so from that point forward, the one guy that was kind of maybe holding things together for the North, he concludes that they've lost. They all begin to pull back. They all begin to fall out. The only problem with this is by the end of the day, as darkness is beginning to fall, Jackson kind of rides out to take a look at the Union lines. Maybe we can attack them again real soon. As he's riding back to his own lines, group of North Carolina soldiers, they mistake him and his staff for a Union cavalry patrol. They fire on him. Jackson is wounded and would later die of pneumonia. So Lee, though, now has again another massive unqualified victory against the North. He's driven Hooker's forces kind of backwards. He's knocked them out of the way, and he now has easy access with his army to the Shenandoah Valley, which he can use as a shield to invade the North one more time. So this gives you a good idea. You know, Lee's moving up with his forces, and then most of it goes around, beside, and partly behind Hooker's forces at Chancellorsville. This is an artist's rendition to give you an idea. This is Jackson leading his men forward, rallying his troops in the fighting and in the confusion of the forest. He says, okay, guys, we got to go forward. And he is going to be pushing them at all points. He's extremely active out there directing the various brigades and divisions of his troops. Okay, you guys got to go in this direction. You guys got to hit this way. Keep moving, reform. And he's extremely successful, of course. It is going to be a major loss as Jackson would go down and never return to fight for the Confederacy, as he dies here in 1863. All right, Lee's intention here. Lee had a major campaign kind of already planned out of what he wanted to do in the North. All right, his plan is to invade the North. Number one goal is to get his army out of Virginia. Let's go eat Pennsylvania's stuff rather than the South's stuff. And so, in that regard, the whole strategy was very successful. But two, if we can fight and win some kind of battle, all right? If we can fight and win some kind of battle against Northern forces, that may be enough to send the signal to England that, hey, the Confederacy is strong enough to kind of win. You guys can come in and help us with victory. Basically the same thing that had happened to the United States when they win the Battle of Saratoga, and France comes in on the United States' side in the Revolutionary War. And then, hopefully, if you can draw the Army of the Potomac out into the much more open territory of southern Pennsylvania, rather than the kind of heavily wooded areas of northern Virginia, the better maneuverability and strategical kind of thinking of the Army of Northern Virginia would play to their strengths. So even though the Army of the Potomac is going to outnumber the South, they would be able to use their advantages, and then maybe if we can destroy the Army of the Potomac, we might not even need foreign help. We can go and we can occupy Washington, we can go and occupy Philadelphia. In the middle of this crisis, as Hooker is trying to move his army to kind of put the Army of the Potomac in between Lee's army and Washington, where is this guy going? You know, what's he going to do? Hooker is fired because Hooker's a loser. And he's replaced with a Pennsylvania general named George Gordon Meade. All right? So you can imagine being Meade, who, okay, Lee's invaded the North. He's knocked the snot out of our army another several times. By the way, you need to save the nation. Meade is the senior commander that's kind of on the spot, and he's the only one that Lincoln can really turn to. So he's kind of the person of last resort. All right. Lee loses contact with his cavalry scouts during a lot of this period. He loses track of the enemy. Ostensibly, part of his army is headed towards Gettysburg looking for shoes, but the reality of this is that Gettysburg was just a crossroads town here in southern Pennsylvania, and they needed to kind of control the area. Union forces, cavalry forces initially, under John Buford, realized that the hills south and east of town are really, really vital, and they need to control the road network as well. And so his forces take up position west of Gettysburg, and a division of troops of Alabamians under Harry Heath runs kind of into these guys. And so, okay, well, is this just local militia, or is this cavalry? What is this? And so the fighting starts to intensify, despite the fact that Lee had issued orders that until we have a clear picture of exactly where the Union Army is, we need to avoid general engagements, okay? But what happens is this fighting that kind of starts out pretty small gets bigger and bigger as both sides begin to draw in reinforcements. And so Harry Heath begins to drive John Buford's undersized cavalry division backwards, but then eventually Buford receives reinforcements from Reynolds' infantry corps as they begin to ride up, and so then Harry Heath's division is beginning to is outnumbered and pushed backwards, but then forces begin to arrive to augment these guys, and so Lee, throughout a lot of this period of battle, of the first day of fighting, is kind of wondering, what the heck is going on? Did I not issue orders that we weren't supposed to, start fighting yet? And so he sends out riders and he sends out people to figure out kind of what's going on. And he finally gets a hold of Harry Heath, and he's like, what's going on here? Didn't I order you to not start, fighting? Well, I ran into these guys, and then the next thing you know, I'm tangling with half the Northern Army. And so, at any rate, this is the situation that Lee, kind of has to deal with. His army is fighting, like it or not, and they begin to receive reports, of course, that part of his army that had sent north towards Harrisburg. Now they hear the fighting, and they begin marching south. Even though the fact that the Federals now have a decent-sized number of troops on the field, he's got a very large number of troops that are coming down, and they basically tell him, look, we're coming down from the north. These guys are facing west. We can come down darn near behind these guys and just crush them. All right, Lee, what do you want us to do? And so Lee, thinks about it. All right, that's it. Attack. All commands, attack. You guys come in, outflank them, and we are going to smash as much of the Federal Army here as we can. All right? And that's exactly what happens here. Lee outflanks a very large part of the Army of the Potomac Army, messes it up really, really badly. And of course, at the end of the day, these guys are left reeling. They flee through the town of Gettysburg. The Confederates would capture the town, but they do take up position on top of the high ground, the hills that would guard the major roads to the south and to the east. So if you look at the end of it, as darkness closes on the first day of the fighting, Lee wins. Lee's definitely, the Army of Northern Virginia is the winner. They've inflicted more casualties, they've captured more ground, they definitely have a moral impetus, but the United States Army still is bringing up a lot more forces. They got a lot of dudes, and they're still marching towards the battlefield. And more importantly, they are going to hold the high ground as a result of this. The map gives you a good idea of kind of why Gettysburg is important. It was not important before this. Okay, nobody cared about Gettysburg. All right, but you can see roads here from the south, southeast, east, northeast, northwest, west. You got a rail line, and so it's pretty important, for that reason. And so then, the fighting is these guys are going to kind of come in here, and then the Union forces come out and meet them. This is where Ewell's corps is going to come in and just smash these guys and begin to drive them backwards. And so at the end of the first day's fighting, this ring is sort of fishhook shape of hills and ridges is where the Union Army, as it's beginning to receive reinforcements, that's where they begin to gather in the darkness at the end of the first day's fighting. So when day 2 dawns, Lee decides, all right, one of the goals that we can have is to smash the Army of the Potomac. If we can get it to where we can crush it, then we should take that opportunity. And that's exactly what he is going to do. He decides to continue to attacking, and basically orders attacks on the 2 large hills that dominate either end, the northern and the southern end of the Union position. The one to the north was kind of to be a feint, to draw off reserves to that way. But the main one was going to come and swing down and be what we refer to as an oblique attack, where you come in sort of at an angle, at about a 45-degree angle, and you hit, the first part of the line that you hit is you're going to hit here, and then they send reinforcements that way, and then they send reinforcements that way, and then eventually you run out of reinforcements in the middle, and you smash up through that way. The problem is, both of them, instead of basically coming at 45s, as they ran into Union opposition, they turned. And they turned into frontal assaults, which really wasn't exactly what Lee had in mind to go in. And the attacks are both uphill. In the areas in front of the hilly areas, Confederate forces have a great deal of success. They drive these guys out of the peach orchard, out of the Plum Run area. They drive them back across the various farms that are in front of Cemetery Ridge. Florida troops, they earn the nickname at this point of the Whirlwind Brigade because they drive their forces forward like the forces in front of them like a whirlwind. But eventually, both of them stop making headway and they stall. All right. The battle on Little Round Top is a very interesting sort of exchange because at the very southern end of the line, this is the very end of the Union line. And so if you can take control of this, you can begin to outflank the entire Union Army. The South very nearly succeeds. in capturing this. Eventually, the very left end of the line is under the command of a guy from Maine named Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. He's in command of a regiment of the 20th Maine, and his forces received the brunt of this attack of these Alabamians who kind of come up at the hill at him and try to drive him off. His forces, he starts the battle with like 300 guys. He ends the battle with like, I think 100 or something like that. And they're repelling these guys as they're coming up the hill to try to attack them on the back side of the hill. The fighting was, was on the front, and then it wrapped around all the way to the back side of the hill. There's nobody to the left of him. He can't fall back. He can't retreat. He can't go to get more ammunition when he begins to run out. And so when they're finally out of ammunition, he orders his men to fix bayonets and to charge into the Confederates. He figures, well, the Confederates, they got to be tired too. They've been fighting all day. Maybe this will catch them off guard, and it does. Okay, it pushes them backwards, and basically it saves the United States Army, the entire United States Army, from disaster. This is what the fighting on the front side of Little Round Top looked like. These nice sort of hilly boulders provides some natural firing positions for a lot of these guys, and the Confederate forces are trying to take this or trying to get up this hill, and they would not succeed in doing so. This is what it looks like on the back side of the hill, which is much more heavily wooded, and this is the counterattack charge by Chamberlain's guys from Maine, taking a lot of these Alabama guys prisoners because they don't expect them to come out and come after them in this fashion. So if you're keeping track of kind of what's going on, at the end of 2 days of fighting, Lee's actually doing a pretty good job of thrashing the Northern Army. I mean, if you just want to keep track of who's got more black eyes and bloody noses, the South is probably winning. They've definitely killed or wounded probably way more guys on the Northern Army than the other way around. The problem is they haven't really shattered it. He hasn't really defeated it. Longstreet, urges us, let's stop trying to attack these guys frontally. Let's move around their army and outflank them. But Lee says, no, all right, we've attacked them on kind of both wings. And so they've reinforced both wings, which means that the center, they've got a very long line, their center is very weak. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make a direct assault right on the center, and the hope is that the center would break, and then instead of one big Federal army, you'd have two small ones, because they'd be in two little sort of isolated pockets, and then you crush one and you crush the other. And so Napoleon, would fight battles like this. But in order to do that, you're going to have a massive artillery bombardment, because you've got a big open field to try to get across, and you've got to crush these guys across from you in order to get across there. And so basically it gathers every gun in the every cannon in the Army of Northern Virginia, and they launch this huge artillery bombardment. It's heard as far away as Washington, D.C. The thunder, my goodness, what is that, a thunderstorm? But in Pittsburgh, that was so close that they were, Lee's army's here. It was just such a massive artillery bombardment that you could hear it for miles and miles around, right? And it does a good job of kind of battering these guys, but it really fails to fatally weaken the U.S. line. And so 3 divisions of infantry that's put under James Longstreet's command, they begin what is often referred to as Pickett's charge towards the U.S. center. One of the divisional commanders was George Pickett, in command of a division of Virginians. They were the only, of the 3 divisions, his was the only one that hadn't been engaged in the fighting yet. 2 of the other divisions were from A.P. Hill's corps. They had fought on the first day. Pickett is going to come in now. This is his first time with his troops fighting at Gettysburg. And as these guys go forward, because the Federal line hasn't been heavily damaged by artillery fire, Federals are going to exact some really, really heavy casualties as these Confederates are moving across basically like a mile of open territory to try to get to the Union lines. First by artillery fire, and then eventually with rifle and artillery fire as they get closer. But the Confederate forces, they press forward, they funnel their attack at one small point here of a small stone wall on a farm that the U.S. was trying to defend, and it actually briefly breaks the Federal line. But the problem is the Confederates take so many casualties in moving across this field and kind of up this ridge line that they're unable to hold it. And U.S. reinforcements seal this off. They eventually pinch off the breach. They take a lot of these guys captive. And a lot of these guys are forced to kind of limp back, shattered to Lee's lines. Lee, for his part, he's gone from almost winning the battle to just an unqualified disaster. His huge number of his army has fallen here during Pickett's charge. And Lee, to his credit, a lot of times after military defeat, you try to blame somebody else. You say, well, I told Longstreet this is how I wanted it, and Longstreet really didn't do it the right way. And Longstreet, for his part, he didn't think it was going to work, and he never really had a lot of, he didn't really have a lot of oomph. He was looking to sort of place blame on other people through a lot of the battle when he could have been taking a little more active role in, when to launch the attack and what, how to go forward. He just kind of was like, okay, the artillery's going to go here, and then you guys just go whenever you kind of feel like it. Longstreet really didn't organize it very well. Now, it may be because he didn't want to do it at all, which is true, he didn't. But still, when you got a job to do, you should at least maybe try to do it a little better. But Lee doesn't blame Longstreet. I do. But Lee doesn't blame him. He says it's all his fault. He offered to resign. No, you're not going to resign. His men, loved him at this point. And in fact, many of them, volunteered. Oh, well, it's okay. Let's hit him again. Let's reform and hit him again. And Lee's like, no, that's enough. That's enough. Okay. Lee is going to lose 25,000 men. The North is going to lose 20,000 men in the battle. Okay, so this is across 3 days. This is 55,000 Americans that are going to die. All right. The problem is Lee, with a southern population, Lee can't replace these losses. The North, they're going to be able to find 20,000 guys that they can draft or something like that, and get them back into uniform. So this is, when you look at this battle of attrition, this is part of the reason why the North's population advantage is what it is. And these are these Virginians as they're going forward. They're going up and over the little fences around the Emmitsburg Road as they're trying to get to the Union Army positions. And as somebody who has tried to climb one of these little fences when you've got these slippery leather shoes on and you got a whole company of men trying to get over them, it actually is pretty hard. I've never been shot at while doing it, but at least not with real bullets. But yeah, it's pretty difficult. And as they get closer and closer, you'll notice that more and more casualties begin to drop out as they get sort of shot to pieces from U.S. rifle fire. Until finally, when they get to the stone wall, there's almost like none of them left. They do sort of drive these guys off briefly, but it all amounts to nothing but defeat. And then when you look in the aftermath of this, when we talk about Lincoln's Gettysburg Address to commemorate the opening of the cemetery here, what just ghastly, grisly, death and destruction. You see just photographers, they have just books and books full of corpses that fell here at Gettysburg. And part of the reason why you see so many pictures of corpses is photography was not to the point where you could take a picture of like somebody running. So there are no like action photos of the Civil War because you had to hold perfectly still for something like 10 seconds in order to get a good image on the plate. So, the best people to have pose are dead people because they're not going to move. So you saw lots and lots of photos of this, but you looked everywhere. You just had dead people just all over the place here at Gettysburg, right? So when we shift our focus here in 1863 away from the Eastern Theater to the Western Theater, Grant, has been tasked with, throughout the end of kind of 1862 and then on into 1863, hey, you've got to go and capture the rest of the Mississippi River. You got to open it up for our traffic, and you got to close it off for Confederate traffic, getting across the river. And Grant's forces, they've been going down the river. They've been going down from north to south. They've been, sort of fighting off the Confederates there. But eventually, the big sort of problem here is the big fortress town of Vicksburg. Okay, there was this one section sort of anchored by Vicksburg, and Vicksburg is just the seemingly impregnable fortress because it sits on this very high bluff around a bend in the river, which means that any ships that try to get past it are going to get shot on from the top by the cannons that are up on top of the bluffs. To the north of the city, you've got this big swamp, the Yazoo swamp, this impenetrable, sort of nasty, mosquito-infested, terrible place. And so they had tried several times. Grant tries several times for basically nearly a year, from the middle of 1862 all the way to the middle of 1863, to try to capture it. And he tries to march in from the north, and he's got this narrow little line. Nathan Bedford Forrest cavalry comes in, and they cut his communications, so he's not getting any more food, so he's got to turn around, he's got to go back. They try to fight their way into the western bank and fight their way across on the Arkansas side of the river, and they get across from Vicksburg, and then, yep, that's where Vicksburg is. It's over there, and we're over here. So what do we do? Well, you said, you should maybe go south of the town and then go across. What are we going to do? Swim across? You've got to get the ships that are north of the town, south of the town. And so, maybe we can send some guys up through the swamp and attack it from the north. Sherman would go up through there, and exactly what you would think would happen when you take an army into a nasty, infested swamp that's relatively easily defended, because there's only a few places that you can take an army without them sinking up to their necks, is exactly what happens. Well, okay, hey, maybe we can dig a canal across this bend in the river and fill it up with water. We can just get past we won't have to go past the bluffs. We can just float across on this canal. No, nothing happens with that. So finally, here in the middle of 1863, Grant says, look, we're just going to have to suck it up, and we're going to have to try to run our ships past Vicksburg at night and hope they don't get all shot to pieces. And that's exactly what they do. He gets the ships to go past. They do start getting fired on. They, for the most part, make it. And now he's got his flotilla south of the town, and they can ferry his forces across the river. And he would then land his forces on the eastern side, on the Mississippi side, south of Vicksburg. And so what he does is he attacks the city from basically the backside, the eastern side. He drives Confederate reinforcements that are sent to the area back to Jackson, the capital of Mississippi, and then he turns west and he begins driving these guys backwards towards Vicksburg. It fights a series of battles, Big Black River, Champions Hill, and inexorably he drives them in a rather brilliant campaign towards Vicksburg, and eventually he kind of closes in on it. The Confederate forces pull into the city in order to try to defend it. Grant begins to lay siege to it. He brings in these heavy guns. They start shelling this thing. And so for weeks after weeks after weeks, eventually he starves out the defenders. It was getting so bad in there that they were eating the undigested little bits of corn from the horse manure that they were finding. I mean, it was bad, okay? It was bad for these guys that were in there. And they surrendered on July 4th of 1863. This is the day after Lee is defeated at the Battle of Gettysburg on July 3rd. So you've got, right in succession, July 3rd, July 4th, whack, whack, two big Union Army successes right back to back, right around Independence Day. So don't think that this doesn't get played up for massive sort of political gain here for the North. And so this is what happens here. You know, this is Vicksburg across the bend in the river, and then eventually Grant's forces, you know, he gets the Navy down here. Grant goes up through here, drives off these forces of Jackson, then turns westward, and then lays siege to Vicksburg with this fighting as well. And this gives you an idea of why Vicksburg is so difficult to take. These bluffs that guards the river. But this is during the siege. You know, Grant's lobbing shells into Vicksburg. He's got it completely cut off so that they can't receive reinforcements, and eventually they would surrender. Confederate forces are going to take this, and they're okay. We need to do something here because in the east, even though we lost at Gettysburg, we're still doing pretty well in the east. You know, we're defending the capital. The North hasn't really made any serious headway. Our major problem is in the west. We're continuing to lose battles. We're continuing to lose ground out in the west. And so what they do is, for briefly, they transfer part of Lee's army. They transfer Longstreet's corps down to the Army of Tennessee, which had been sort of outflanked and pushed out of Chattanooga, Tennessee, and then into northern Georgia. And they're going to fight a major battle with Union forces at a place called Chickamauga in northwest Georgia. And Longstreet's forces are going to array themselves here, and they're going to go forward, and they're going to catch these guys completely off guard. Or rather, actually, what happens is the Union forces are going to make a mistake in their orders, and they're going to pull these guys back, and they're going to leave a giant gap that happens to be right in front of Longstreet's line. And so when the Union forces are receiving this Confederate attack, Longstreet, they just go right through. They just go right through, and they snap the Union line just in half. The right flank of the Union Army routs and runs off. The left flank sort of coalesces together on a hill under the command of a general named Thomas, and they kind of hold off these massive Confederate attacks all day, and they give the rest of the Union Army a chance to retreat to Chattanooga, Tennessee, but these guys are really kind of broken and beaten. And they're holding Chattanooga, and we're going to see that Bragg's Army of Tennessee, they're going to lay siege to Chattanooga. It makes it very difficult for these guys to get food. They've got all the hills, Lookout Mountain, and they've got Missionary Ridge all around this area. And so it looks really, really bad. Grant, though, had brought in reinforcements from the west. He had reopened the supply lines, and eventually they would attack these guys on Lookout Mountain, on Missionary Ridge. They'd fight what's called Battle Above the Clouds, where they wound up fighting on this hillside. And he drives Confederate forces away from Chattanooga towards the end of 1863. So for these string of victories that Grant had put forward, finally Lincoln realizes that he's got the guy that should have been the quarterback of his team maybe a year ago. And what he does is Lincoln names Grant the general-in-chief of all the U.S. armies. All right, Lincoln is as the president, he's the commander-in-chief, but Grant, you're my top guy. You're the guy that's going to figure out exactly how the military side of this is going to work. All right. what he does is he divides up the war effort into kind of two major parts. And that is, he would go and assume direct command, more or less, of the Army of the Potomac. They don't fire George Gordon Meade because he had done a good job at Gettysburg, but while he was chasing after Lee, he exhibited some of the same kind of reluctance to go after him that McClellan had had. At one point, Lincoln said, it was like trying to shoot geese off the lawn. He's not really attacking him. He's just, get out of here, go at him. And he and Lee had engaged in a little bit of back and forth in Northern Virginia, but no major fighting that had taken place. And so Grant says, all right, I'm going to go down and I'm going to keep a very close eye on Meade, and basically I'm going to be the Army commander in the East. And then our second major objective is to advance into Georgia and to attack Atlanta, Georgia, the biggest city in the Deep South. And he would leave that up to his second in command, William Sherman. So Sherman is going to take all the forces now that are in the Western Theater, combine them into his army, and he's going to go after Atlanta. All right? Now, when Grant arrives in Virginia in 1863, turns into the spring of 1864, he realizes, okay, I can't outmaneuver Lee. Lee is just awesome at that. So I'm not going to try to fight him in a war maneuver. I've got a huge number of people, and he's got a limited number of people, and so I'm just going to go right at him, and I'm just going to hammer him. I'm just going to hammer him, and I'm going to wear him down by direct assault, and he's going to run out of dudes before I do. And as kind of cold-hearted as that is, that eventually is what's going to work. What's going to work for Grant. So when you look at this overland campaign, sometimes referred to as the 100 Days, Grant versus Lee. All right, Grant is going to march his forces into this wilderness area, similar to the area that had been fought in the Battle of Chancellorsville the year before. And in this thick kind of woods, he's pretty badly beaten. All right, it's a pretty chaotic battle. It's in an even thicker part of the woods than had taken place in the Battle of Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville was kind of fought on the eastern side, which was a little less wooded. This is fought on the western side of the same kind of area. It's really, really thick undergrowth. I mean, even if you still go there today, it's not quite as thick as it was in the 1860s, but it's still really, really thick and heavily wooded. And as he says, he gets both flanks turned and kind of rolled up, especially his left flank, and his center gets pierced. All of this happens while there's a forest fire. It started from the sparks of the rounds going off. And so at the end of this, he's like, yeah, Lee whipped us. And he begins to order his men to kind of retreat backwards from Lee's army. And you gotta think, you put yourself in the shoes of these guys in the Army of the Potomac. McDowell goes and fights a battle, we retreat. McClellan, we go and we down, we fight a battle, we retreat. Pope, we go and we fight a battle, we retreat. Burnside, we go and we fight a battle, we retreat. Hooker, we go and we fight a battle, we retreat. Meade, we didn't really do a whole lot of fighting. We fight in Gettysburg, we win, and then we kind of let them go. So Grant, we go and we fight a battle, now we're on our way backwards. And so when they come to this crossroads, Grant orders these guys that turn right, to go south, go towards Richmond. We're not going back to Washington. We're not going back to the north. We're not going back to our positions. Yeah, we can't beat them here in the wilderness, so we'll find some other place. And there's sort of wild cheering as they're marching through the night. Grant's like, shut up! You don't want them to know which way we're going. Okay? Grant is a different sort of general. Yeah, we lost the wilderness. So, big deal. We're going to see that Lee figures out very quickly what Grant's deal is, that Grant is not the kind of person that he can scare off. And so he realizes that Grant is going to be headed for the crossroads towns of Spotsylvania. And there's a race on now to see who's going to get there first. Is it going to be Grant's army or is it going to be Lee? Lee's army wins. Lee's army wins the race, and they begin what is going to be very characteristic now of basically the rest of the war, which is an outnumbered Confederate army digging serious entrenchments, much like what you're going to see in the First World War, to try to hold off massive assaults by Union infantry. And so Lee's forces entrenched at Spotsylvania, and he's going to attack them across several days. And basically, Lee's going to slaughter huge numbers of Grant's army. And so eventually Grant says, okay, yeah, we're not going to, this nut is too tough to crack. We pushed back part of Lee's line, but they just dug in another entrenchment behind that, so fine. I'm going to order my army again around Lee's right flank to try to find a way to get in between his army and Virginia. They're gonna do this several times, where they kind of dance, and Grant is going to come after him. He's going to do another major direct assault on Lee's forces at a place called North Anna, near the North Anna River. And eventually, though, Lee is going to have a pretty good premonition of where this guy's going to wind up, and he begins entrenching his army early at a place called Cold Harbor. And the entrenchments that wait the Union forces at Cold Harbor are thicker, deeper, and in more detail than really anything they had seen so far. And a lot of the subordinate commanders, they came after Grant before the battle and said, look, hey Grant, this one's no good. We don't need to go in. And of course Grant, no, we got to wear down the Confederate army. We got to grind it. Yeah, we're going to lose more than them, but they can't replace the losses. We need to go in. And it's bad. Okay, it's really, really bad. To the average soldier on the ground, it was pretty obvious. One of the Union corpses that they find at Cold Harbor, he's dead on the ground, and they look in his jacket, he's got his diary that he'd been keeping of the war, and it's got the day's date, 1864, and it just says, I was killed. He knew he was going to die. And so, about 8,000 Union soldiers are going to go down in the first few minutes of the fighting because the Confederates are so well entrenched, they've got overlapping fields of fire, they start cutting into these guys as soon as they break the trees to come and attack them. Even with that, actually with the weight of all the Union forces, though, they still managed to almost break the Confederate center. The arrival of the brigade of troops from Florida does kind of save the day. But overall, this is a massive, massive bloodbath for the Union. After the war was over, Grant in his memoirs, he would later write that the one attack that he really regretted was ordering the one at Cold Harbor. But there's nothing you can do but keep going, keep soldiering on, and that's exactly what's going to happen. We can't get through them at Cold Harbor, we'll try to outflank them again and go this way. And so this gives you a good idea. Wilderness, Spotsylvania, North Anna, Cold Harbor, until eventually we'll see that the fighting will move south of the James River, okay, to the city called Petersburg. Photo gives you a decent idea of sort of the confusion of fighting in the middle of a forest fire at the Battle of the Wilderness. These are the Confederate entrenchments that are only going to get bigger and deeper as the war goes on. This is Updike's attack on the center of the Confederate line as these guys are fighting them off, and you can see now they're getting the breastworks are getting higher and higher and more detail as the fighting would go on. So while Grant is going after Lee in 1864, Sherman is tasked with going to capture Atlanta. Now, one of the things that Sherman has to deal with as a bonus, rather than Grant, is Grant's got to move through the relatively narrow kind of confining territory of northern and eastern Virginia. Sherman's got a lot more sort of openings in that if you look north and west of Atlanta, there are a series of kind of ridges that radiate outward that are at the southern end of the Appalachian Mountains. And what that means is there are a number of these kind of gaps that Sherman can go after. And so Sherman, unlike Grant, instead of using kind of sledgehammer kind of tactics, he is going to use maneuver to try to outposition these Confederate forces to drive them back towards Atlanta. A good example is what takes place here at the Battle of Resaca. There's just one sort of little gap near the Etowah River, and Confederate forces are kind of fighting there. They fight a little two-day battle here around Resaca. Confederate forces kind of hold, but all of this is, Sherman sends these forces here. Okay, we can't get through this gap, but we'll march through another one. And the Confederates now, they're going to get behind us. So then they have to fall back to another position. Again, Grant can kind of feint towards one gap, try to force, no, not through here. Then we'll go through another one. And so they kind of do this little dance, kind of back and forth, over here, no, over there. But all the while, Sherman is kind of husbanding his forces. He's not spending a whole lot of them in battle. And he's moving ever closer towards Atlanta until finally Joseph Johnston, who is now the Army of Tennessee's commander, has got these guys kind of on the outskirts. They're on the northern parts of Atlanta. And Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, he gets pretty disgusted with this. This is not politically working out very well for him, that it looks like one of his major military commanders, all he's doing is yielding territory. Because looking at it from a distance, it looks like Johnston's just falling back without fighting a lot. But of course the military reality is, well, I have to fall back because these guys are coming in, from different directions. So basically Davis comes to the decision that Johnston's not aggressive enough. We need a more aggressive commander. One who's going to do what Lee did when Richmond was threatened and attack the Northern Army. He's going to attack Sherman. All right? So he appoints a Texan, a guy named John Bell Hood, who by this point in the war had lost an arm at Gaines Mill on the peninsula. He had lost a leg fighting at Gettysburg. And so he had to have help, getting on a horse. Basically, had to be strapped onto a horse in order to maintain his balance. And so he's not a whole man. He's sort of a half man, or maybe 2/3 man. But he's aggressive. You know, go after him. We're going to go get him. We're going to come to this plant. We're going to hold here, and then we're going to outflank Sherman's army. We're going to attack him. And ironically, it may have worked, some of his counterattacks. The earliest one that you're going to see is it's actually thwarted by these group of Union soldiers who are actually in the wrong spot, but they serve as an early warning that the rest of Sherman's army needs to kind of face left and hold these guys off. Sherman does hold off these attacks. You know, Hood tries to hit him on the left and tries to hit him on the right, and they go sort of back and forth. But eventually, they weakens Hood's army so badly that Sherman begins to invest this area, and so finally, he cuts the last major rail line to the city when he captures Jonesboro, south of town, and now the Confederates, they have no way to get resupply. You know, they could get surrounded and trapped, and so the only thing that Hood has left to do is to evacuate Atlanta and leave it to Union forces. Sherman forces then move into Atlanta and burn it to the ground. I have probably in quotes. There's a lot of dispute because the Confederates definitely did leave their stores, you know, that they couldn't carry out. They burned them so that way the Union forces couldn't get them. Whether or not Sherman actually started new fires, spread the fires, they didn't do a whole lot to save Atlanta. And so some people say it was really unfair to say that he burned Atlanta to the ground. Maybe with how much malicious intent, I don't know. But it's really easy to believe because there are going to be a lot of other cities that he is going to intentionally burn to the ground a lot later. There's William Tecumseh Sherman. He's a tough fighter. Unlike Grant, who was kind of soft-spoken and kind of reserved, kind of laid back, Sherman was a manic. He was always kind of talking, chomping on a cigar. He probably seemed like somebody that today maybe had like ADHD or something like that. So he's a different sort of personality with this. And this gives you kind of a good idea of just kind of the back and forth nature of kind of how the fighting sort of works itself out as Sherman outmaneuvers Johnston to get closer and closer to Atlanta until eventually Johnston is replaced by Hood. This is a scene of a fighting that we did about 10 years ago. Yours truly is just off to the right of the camera, holding off these guys at Pickett's Mill, one of the battles outside of Atlanta. So, give you an idea of what some of these battles may have looked like had you have been there. And this, of course, is the burning of Atlanta. The closest I could find of this was a picture from the film Gone with the Wind. But hey, a city on fire is a city on fire. It gives you a good idea of kind of what's going to take place here. Now, one of the hard things for students to swallow is the idea that, Lincoln would not win an election because he's Abraham Lincoln. He's on the money in like two places. There's the giant marble statue of him in Washington. I mean, his birthday is like one of the holidays. So, it's Lincoln. He's one of the great American heroes. And so, this seems sort of crazy. But as Lincoln is getting here into 1864, this is a re-election year for him. And he's got to deal with a very real possibility that he may lose. Because Lincoln actually has a lot of tough opposition, okay? The Democrats were ever increasingly favoring, hey, look, the Republicans, you guys are the ones that are spending all this money to fight this war. All these people, look at the casualty list in the newspaper every week. People are dying. Thousands and thousands of people are dying. If the South wants to go, let them go. Lincoln has a serious problem here. Like I said, not all the Democrats just drop dead or become Republicans just because he wins the election. Democrats are going to nominate the very popular General George McClellan to be their nominee. McClellan's already kind of out of the army, but he still was very popular. They thought that he could maybe win the soldier vote. Lincoln also had to do some things to get his hands a little dirty in order to prosecute the war so far. He had been forced to suspend a lot of civil liberties. He had gone in some pro-Confederate newspapers that had been operating. He'd shut them down, threw people in jail. In some cases, he just went in, for example, like the Baltimore people that were talking about secession, he just went and locked them up. And when they sued, he said, well, wait a minute, you've got us in jail, but you've got to charge us with a crime. Now, I'm going to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, which means normally if you're going to be held in jail, you've got to be officially charged with a crime. The government of the United States can't just grab you and throw you in jail and not tell you, okay, you've been charged with murder or theft or, I don't know, illegally pirated DVDs off the internet. I don't know, whatever it is that you're doing. So, you can't just hold people. But during times of rebellion, the President of the United States can do that. And he can basically, yeah, you're a rebel. I'm not a rebel. I'm just a Democrat that doesn't like you. Yeah, whatever. Shut up, rebel. You're going to jail. And he did. He threw a lot of people in jail. He shut down one of the elections in one of the western states that he didn't like. He told the pro-union governor, okay, you're in charge. Just overturning, elections. Lincoln had done some stuff, okay? And a lot of people complain, so wait a minute, the Constitution, you're not allowed to do some of this stuff. And Lincoln, of course, hey, I got to save the Union, we'll worry about the Constitution later. Okay, I don't know how you feel about that, but, a lot of people didn't like it. And, of course, the number one problem of all is Union armies had no major offensive triumphs. They've been ramming their head against Richmond for 4 years. And all that they had to show for it was a whole bunch of dead guys. Mostly their own. They had captured New Orleans kind of early on, and yeah, they captured Vicksburg, but I mean, who had ever heard of Vicksburg before the war? So, Lincoln needs a victory. And in fact, up to a few weeks, up until September of 1864, Lincoln was telling people, yeah, I'm not gonna get reelected. It's just not gonna happen. We're gonna have to deal with, hopefully the Democrats aren't gonna just let the South go, and then now, anytime you lose an election, you take seats from the Union. But Sherman capturing Atlanta changes all that, okay? Because he captures Atlanta in September, and basically then the popular movement, massive southern city, it falls, big victory, super. Lincoln's victory all of a sudden surges into first place. Lincoln also gave troops furloughs. In some cases, he gave them furloughs, those that couldn't vote by absentee, so they could go home to vote. And of course, hey, Lincoln gave me a furlough. Who are you going to vote for? I don't know. The guy who gave me a furlough. What we're going to see, though, is in the election of 1864, Lincoln is going to pick a guy who had been a Democrat, a Southern Democrat, a guy from Tennessee who did not like slavery, did not like secession, refused to yield his seat when his state seceded. Picks a guy named Johnson, and he says, we're going to be a national unity ticket, a Republican and a Democrat, we're going to get together, and the nation would unite behind Lincoln to finish the war effort. So the war isn't going to stop with this, and so we're going to see that the popular vote, is a pretty good spread, 55 to 45 in favor of Lincoln. But when you look at the electoral vote, blam, he blows McClellan out of the water. McClellan wins almost no states in this regard. And of course, the Confederate states, for some reason, they didn't vote. They didn't vote in the election whatsoever. Well, after you capture Atlanta, what do? I mean, what else is there in Georgia, to do? The Confederate forces that had been guarding Atlanta, well, they've lost Atlanta now, so you got nothing left to guard. And actually, Hood goes on leans on his offensive kind of mindset and decides, all right, we're gonna go around Sherman's army and we're gonna march back into Tennessee behind him. We're gonna try to recapture the state. And it kind of throws Sherman off a little bit, but he figured, there's no way that they can recapture it. And actually, they had a decent chance had somebody other than the idiotic John Bell Hood been in charge. There was a decent chance that maybe they could have. But they wound up fighting a series of stupid battles. They wound up getting slaughtered by these troops, assaulting them directly at Franklin when they could have just crossed the river and outflanked these guys. And then eventually they do make their way all the way to the northern end of the state. They attack the state capital here at Nashville. But eventually they're repelled, and then Union forces finally get back together and counterattack, and they do drive them off. So while they fail to recapture Tennessee, they do throw a decent scare into the Union works. Sherman, for his part, is not worried, okay? And since there's now no major kind of threat in front of them, Sherman had lobbied Grant. He says, listen, let me march my army just through the middle of Georgia. I'll just march right through the middle of secessionist territory, and that'll prove a major political point. But Sherman also wanted to wage an economic war. And he launches on this kind of 60-mile wide path of destruction where they basically burn everything of use in sight. They burn down houses, they rip up crops, they tear up the railroad tracks, they burn down bridges. And the idea is that all of this material resource is going to the Confederate Army's benefit. And so if you rip that economic base out from under them, then they'll use it that much quicker before the Confederate war effort just kind of falls apart. So a lot of people, this is wrong. These guys aren't soldiers. Why are you attacking them? They're just people at home. And of course, Sherman's point was, no, their stuff is helping the Confederate Army win. And so helping the Confederate Army stay in the field. He would march across the state, and by December he would capture Savannah on the east coast, and then as winter would turn into spring, he moves into the Carolinas, and he's going to burn cities as he goes. He's going to burn his way through South Carolina much the same way that he burned his way through Georgia. This is where the major routes is going to take Sherman across Georgia, eventually into Savannah, and then of course Sherman would go into it, burn Columbia, burn Charleston from the westward side. He's the one that's finally going to capture Charleston and been so ably defended by the Confederates since the beginning of the war, and then eventually march northward and start heading towards North Carolina, where he would burn some more stuff. One of the things you would see all over the place is what they refer to as Sherman's neckties. They would rip up the railroad lines of the South, and you would take the metal rails off the top, and then you pile up the wooden ties, the cross ties, into a big fire, into a big pile, set it on fire, and then you would get the two ends of the rail, and you would heat up the middle, and so that the ends would stay cool enough where you could kind of hold them, and the middle would heat up and get real malleable, and what you would do is you'd wrap it around a tree, so that way it became unusable to the Confederates. They couldn't repair it very easily, and of course they would see this wrapped around these trees, and they said, oh, those are Sherman's neckties, which is a little bit of a derisive name. This is Columbia, South Carolina. I know a lot of you are like, oh, this is right after the neutron bomb fell on them, maybe in World War II or something. No, this is after it's a burned out husk from what Sherman did to it. Lots and lots of southern towns and cities suffered this treatment under Sherman because, as he said, he's trying to, he says, as bad as the war is now, it'll be over that much sooner, which I'll leave it to your sensibilities whether or not, burning people out of house and home is the right way to win a war. So, Grant, throughout this period, while Sherman is capturing Atlanta and doing all this kind of stuff, Grant is moving forward ever closer and closer, and eventually the war moves, the fighting here in Virginia moves south of Richmond to the railroad junction town of Petersburg, because Petersburg is Richmond's last rail link to the rest of the South. And Lee digs in his army. He's got a massive set of entrenchments, and Grant, very mindful of the slaughter that he had caused to his army at Cold Harbor, he decides not to risk a frontal attack. And so what happens is both sides begin basically a World War I style of entrenchment, where both sides start entrenching longer and longer lines of kind of trenches, and this turns into a very long siege, basically a 10-month kind of siege, almost a year. The fighting that takes place, or in some cases lack of fighting that takes place around Petersburg, Virginia. There are a few attacks that take place here. The major problem, though, for Lee's army is one of morale and really economics. And that is, over the winter of 1864, 1865, his army begins to go home. These guys are receiving letters from their wives and their mothers and the sisters that they've left at home, and they're saying, look, we're starving to death. We can't manage the farm, we can't manage the business, we can't get stuff at the store, we can't do things without you. If you don't come home, we may die. And so ever increasingly, a lot of these guys look and they say, okay, we're getting surrounded from kind of all sides. Sherman's guys are moving up from the south. Grant's guys are investing us here. And so ever increasingly, these guys are just, I'm sorry, I got to go home. And so Lee's army significantly loses strength throughout the winter of 1864-65. So finally, as Grant has more numbers, he's able to turn Lee's flank again and again, and he's able to get around the Army of Northern Virginia and capture one of the major crossroad areas in a place called Five Forks, and now he's completely got Lee's army outflanked. Lee realizes this, and now he is forced to order the evacuation of Richmond and get his army to the west, and then hopefully he can link up with other Confederate forces in the western part of Virginia so that he can keep the war going. But at this point now, finally, in the spring of 1865, Richmond finally falls to Union forces. And this is what the Petersburg entrenchments would have looked like, a lot like a World War I kind of trench fighting kind of scene, where you've got, these huge open fields of fire where a lot of the trees are cut down, and then you've got these log embrasures with a glacis of sand or earth on the front to absorb, enemy shot. And you even got these little dugout kind of bunkers that if you are being shelled heavily by enemy artillery, you can kind of hide out in there until it's over with and then man the wall. And so you've got nice clear fields of fire. And of course, both sides would have these types of situations. And so with Lee on the run now, Grant is going to go after him. And he's going to be trying to chase Lee down and try to prevent Lee from joining forces with Johnston's army to Tennessee and possibly then turning on either him or Sherman's army. And he's going to run into a big part of Lee's army at a place called Sailor's Creek, and they're going to fight a big kind of battle that takes place there. About a third of Lee's army is going to be forced to surrender, including my great-great-great-grandfather, who was captured, surrendered in the 8th Florida. And Grant, though, keeps up the pursuit on Lee. And 3 days later, he finally catches up with Lee and is able to partially surround him at a place called Appomattox. Lee decides that, look, the jig is up. We tried as hard as we could. There is no more that I can ask of these people. All right. Lee decides to surrender his army in April of 1865 in the parlor of Wilmer McLean in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. He goes in, he negotiates with Grant the order of surrender. Grant is very lenient with his terms. He says that, look, all you got to do is lay down your arms, swear an oath that you won't take up arms against the United States again, and you guys can go home. Anybody that has a horse or a mule in the Confederate Army can take it home so they can work on their farm with it. Any of the officers can keep their sabers or their pistols as symbols of their rank. They can go home as long as they swear not to fight against the United States. Lee gets a lot of flack for leading the Confederate forces in the Civil War. He's branded as a traitor to the United States, and there's a certain amount of truth to that. Lee had sworn an oath as an officer in the United States Army to be loyal to the U.S. Constitution. His family had helped found the United States in the American Revolution, but he felt that it was his duty to his state to serve with the Confederacy, despite the fact that he didn't agree with secession, he didn't agree with slavery, and so he gets a lot of trouble, from a lot of people for his positions during the war. One of the things that he doesn't get enough credit for, though, is once he surrenders his army, he goes around, he urges Southerners. He says, okay, that's it, we tried, it's over. Now we need to loyally return to the Union. We need to rebuild the South. We're part of the United States now. We need to give up any more dreams of trying to have independence, to fight any kind of guerrilla war, to continue to hold these guys off. We need to deal with the political realities, and we need to be good American citizens again. Ironically, because of his actions, Lee's plantation in Northern Virginia had been forcibly taken. It's turned, you now know it as Arlington National Cemetery. And it wasn't until, I think, like the 1980s when finally his family was compensated, when a court said, hey, look, the federal government took this and never compensated Lee's family for it. Oh, but he was a traitor to the Union. Yeah, but still it was his. And so he also never had his citizenship in the United States restored. So anyway, Lee's men, for their part, they tearfully bid him goodbye. They lay down their weapons and they go home to resume their normal lives. This is Lee signing the instruments of surrender. There's Grant. You can see some of his major lieutenants that are with him. And this one, you've got Hancock, you've got Tolliver, you've got the guy who later be slaughtered by Indians, George Armstrong Custer, and then eventually Lee says goodbye to his men. There he is shaking hands. A lot of tears are shed, I am sure, on this sort of fateful day. Lee, at the end of the campaign, has about 28,000 men that are still with him. At the height of his army, he had about 75,000 as they marched in at Gettysburg. And so you can see how kind of Confederate forces fortunes had sunk so low at this point. Lincoln, for his part, begins to take a very conciliatory tone with the defeated South after Lee surrendered, and then after a few days later, Johnston surrenders the Army of Tennessee. And we're going to see that throughout the South, then, the resisting Confederate forces, all right, that's it. Time's up. Time to surrender. And they would do so. Eventually, Jefferson Davis is captured in Georgia, trying to escape to Cuba. And so all the members of the Confederate government are pretty much round up. And so Lincoln, for his part, says, okay, Southerners, we're not going to treat you badly. You're Americans now. It would be dumb for us to, pound you when you're a part of us. That's like punching yourself in the face because you think your nose is ugly. So anyway, but what you're going to see is into this is going to be one of our major sort of political changers, one of the real game changers, and that's this guy who's an outraged Southern actor, a guy named John Wilkes Booth. He joins in with this cabal of people to assassinate basically the entire Lincoln administration. They're going to go after Lincoln. They're going to go after his cabinet members, prominent members of the government. And they're all got these plots of how they're going to get after him. Only one other guy is actually successfully attacked. He would not die. The only person who is successfully assassinated is Lincoln. Booth sneaks up behind Lincoln. He is at Ford's Theater. He is watching a rendition, a play called Our American Cousin. And he puts a bullet in the back of Lincoln's head. He would jump down to the stage, break his leg, and doing so he would shout Sic Semper Tyrannis, which is the state motto of Virginia, meaning death to tyrants, basically. He would run out of the theater. He'd later be caught, and he would die. Lincoln, for his part, he's going to die the next day. And a lot of people kind of regard Abraham Lincoln as kind of the last casualty of the American Civil War. So this is an artist that's kind of giving you an idea of Lincoln. He's completely taken off guard, and blam, he's shot in the back of the head. He would die the next day. When we look at the war in the rearview mirror, the number one thing that we cannot overlook, okay, is the ridiculous death toll. Just the insane number of people that died. All right, 60,000 Americans, 600,000 Americans are going to die in the American Civil War. Just when you put that into proportion, okay, of what the population of the United States was like at that point, this is crazy. Especially since you got to remember that most of the people who are in the Army that are going to be suffering these casualties are young men that would have gone on to father families and have jobs and start businesses and do that kind of thing. And so you're going to see a lot of single women that are going to grow old and never get married because the guys that they probably would have married died in the Civil War. It is going to be extremely expensive. The war is going to cost $15 billion in direct cost. Okay, this is money that you've got to spend in order to get guns and bullets and hats and knapsacks and stuff like that. And that's in 1860s money. Okay, $15 billion today is nothing like that. I mean, President of the United States probably spends that money on like toilet paper every day. I don't know. And so $15 billion is not as much as it used to be. So you start inflating that up, and it's in like the trillions of dollars today. But that does not include the economic dislocation from the war. So you start burning cities like Atlanta and Columbia down. Yeah, you may be mad at them because they're all like pro-slave or pro-Confederate or whatever. But that's wealth that you don't have anymore. I mean, you might say, yeah, but you deserved it. Oh yeah, okay, well you can't have my trade goods anymore. Well, why not? Because you burn them all up, you ninny. So this is the when you look at the economic problems that are going to come from the indirect actions of this, it's pretty bad. Okay, it's pretty bad all around. Okay. But there's great news, okay? There is great news. One, the Union is preserved. There's never been any serious attempt to try to break up the Union again. Sure, you get crackpots every so often in like Alaska or Hawaii or Texas or something like that. Like, we ought to be independent kind of thing. Good luck with that, okay? You saw how secession worked last time, which is a whole bunch of dead people. So generally, this is kind of proving the point that that's not the way you go. And, of course, the big one, the major one that we got to fix is slavery is soon, in fact, going to end. And so when you go around to some of these Civil War battlefields, you go around to some Civil War locations, man, it's just great, it's just lined up. This is one of the things that you guys need to understand with this is a lot of people paid kind of the ultimate price to bring this war to a conclusion. And that's the end of the Civil War.